This is a game called Last Full Measure. As the subtitle indicates, it is a game of the Battle of Gettysburg from the American Civil War. This is a Brigade scale game that is a free print-play title offered up by the designer. The system got its first legs as a set of house rules by the designer for a Gettysburg game, Gettysburg 77. And over time, over apparently a long time, he kind of refined it, brought it together, and then felt like it was more than just house rules for that game. It became its own system. So he put together his own artwork, his own map work, and put it out there. He being a dude named Gerald Todd, and you can find his stuff on Board Game Geek, Consim World, and he has most of his artwork available on his own website. You can search and find that stuff pretty easily. Here's a bird's eye view of the map. It's pretty large, 33 by 38 inches. Print and play, so that means I took it to an office supply store and had them print it up for me. Coming in for a closer look, you can see the town and many of the typical features you expect to see. Cemetery Hill and the ridge there. Not sure quite what that is. Might be the airstrip for the aerial reconnaissance drones. All the way to the south, to the Round Tops, even farther south. Plenty of room here. Goes very far to the east, up to the cavalry battlefield that was a feature at the end of the battle. And then the typical areas to the north and west. See, the initial counters are on the board for the beginning of the game. The hexes are 250 yards, and it is a 1 hour per turn time scale. And again, it is Brigade scale, but with a bit of a twist. For instance, this is the Brigade, Meredith's Brigade of the Federal First Corps, maybe better known as the Iron Brigade. The counter art I like. It's got the little bugles on it for the infantry. And just for comparison, cross sabers for the cavalry. But you notice it also looks like regiments. Each of the regiments of that brigade are represented as counters, but it's not a regimental game. Now, I have many times been lured by the siren song of regimental ACW games, and they just don't fit me. I end up being disappointed. It's usually a ton of space and a ton of counters to represent, a kind of uninteresting combat. Big mobs armed with very accurate weapons murdering each other point blank range just doesn't have a lot of variety to it. So when I saw this brigade scaled game with these regimental eye candy counters, I thought, I want to see how this works. And what it ends up being is the designer felt that many brigade scaled games ended up taking those large brigades and using general purpose markers to show the extra frontage they can cover. And he just thought, well, I think I'll kill two birds with one stone. The regiments represent the extra frontage the brigade can cover, but they also represent step markers. So this brigade effectively has 5 steps, even though the numbers are actually strength. The large numbers are strength points, so 300 men, 500 men, so on. But when you take a loss in combat, you would lose a step from the brigade. So I kind of like that. It simplified strength tracking and gave me a little bit of flavor that I like about regimental games, but with a simpler system. And as for the simpler system, the designer considers this an intermediate level game. So I think it does represent intermediate complexity. It's fast playing, which is something I was interested in with this new round of ACW games I'm looking at, but still with enough going on that I felt like it could keep my attention. Now the sequence of play is fairly standard. It is the, one turn, one phasing player does their work and then the other gets a chance, with a little bit of interactivity. So the phases are a command phase, organization, artillery, movement, combat, reorganization, and then that's it. And you flip over to the other player. Special night turns, but that's the basic flow of the game. Now, when I first saw this game, it was kind of in its first iteration, and it was just a Gettysburg game. But then the author, or the designer, started to play with it, started to come up with some different titles. He actually has 2.5 titles now, Gettysburg. He did a second Manassas game that I think is ready to play. And he's working on a South Mountain game. But when I first looked at this game, there was this command system that was really fairly straightforward. You have these leaders, like that's Reynolds of the 1st Corps there, 1st Federal Corps. And he has a division leader, Wadsworth, and he has brigades. And of course we already saw all the regiments for the brigade. And the idea, in the very simple initial command rules I saw, was there is command tracing from brigades to their regiments, and there's also a requirement for brigades to maintain their integrity, meaning they all have to be either stacked or adjacent to each other. And that little bit of command was all that was present. I didn't mind that, because the effect of this was to control attacking. Enemies, or counters I should say, have zones of control, typical, and only those units that were in command could enter a zone of control. And that really represented attacking. Units do not remain in a zone of control at all times. The only time they're in a zone of control, they have to be in combat, and at the end of a combat you either stay in the zone of control and continue fighting, or you retreat out of the zone of control, break contact, and end the fighting. So that was okay. It was simple, and I didn't mind that. I was actually looking forward to playing something fairly simple. But with the development of the other 2 games, I think the designer felt that he needed a little more, and he added a little more in the command rules. And the little more he added, I'll just describe hopefully briefly. We have here Meade, the army leader, and what the, I guess maybe one of the design goals would be to avoid any extra logging or markers or anything off the board that you needed to keep track of this command. So the basic structure is, hierarchical, organizational. Army to corps, corps to division, division to brigade, brigade to, all those regimental components. And you have to put a regiment in command still in order to enter a zone of control. The first level is regiment to brigadier. They have to be within 2 hexes or adjacent to a unit. So it's sort of a, if any member of your brigade is in command, then they're all in command kind of thing. Next, the brigade has to be within a trace range of his division leader, and that trace is 5 hexes. But that division leader has to be within range of his corps leader, or a superior leader, and have rolled his command number. Every leader has a command number. And it actually serves 2 purposes in the game, but for right now that's the command number, 3. So Reynolds has a 5. Meade has a 4. So in order for Wadsworth to be in command, he has to be within, I think it's 5 hexes of his corps leader, Reynolds, and he has to roll a 3 or less on one 6-sided die. But that means he traces up to Reynolds, and of course the trace continues. Reynolds must be within 8 hexes of Meade, and Reynolds must have rolled 5 or less on a 6-sided die. But then Meade himself has to be in command, so he has to roll his number 4 or less on a 6-sided die. So, practically speaking, you would start at the top. You'd roll for Meade. If Meade is in command, then you'd roll for Reynolds. If Reynolds is in command, then you'd roll for Wadsworth. But if at any step in this process anyone is out of command, they can still roll for themselves, but with a penalty. Now this takes place per the sequence of play every turn. All this dice rolling to establish whether or not regiments can enter a zone of control. Now these are my homemade counters from the designer's artwork. I do like that contrast of the bugle for infantry popping out. I think there's more than enough on the counters for me to identify the formations once they're on the board. Maybe it's because I'm so familiar with Gettysburg's games. Again, cavalry has cross sabers for mounted. Then when they dismount, they have the breech-loading rifle there. And then the star indicates that they're breech-loading. That gives them a benefit in the defense. Now we're looking at Union's counters here, but the Confederates, of course, are very similar. Regiments, brigade, and corps. So I'm looking at the brigade and division leaders for the Union. We're seeing those corps badges that the Federals put in place. For the Confederates, these are the original counter colors, sort of the butternut, and then the same iconography, but instead of corps badges, they use the state silhouettes in colors and indicate the different regiments in that brigade. Now I say that is the original butternut because, as can happen with these kinds of print and play games, the author, upon reflection, decided to alter the artwork some. But making counters by hand is really time consuming. So while I may like this new artwork, I think my third corps is going to be butternut forever. So this is a printout of the new artwork. A little darker, makes those bugles pop, but he's also using grays. This happens to be Stuart's cavalry. Light gray, slightly darker shades of gray to differentiate the Rebel First Corps and Second Corps from each other. So my counters will be a little different from what you may find. So back to the sequence of play. After you determine your command, figure out who you can attack with this turn, there's this organization phase and breastworks. Breastworks are a feature of the game for building up defenses, but that organization thing is pretty key. You have basically good order regiments, and then you have disorganization. And there's counters to indicate disorganization, D2, and then D1. Now, disorganization is just one thing. There's your one severity of disorganized. The 1 and 2 indicate essentially how long it's going to be in effect. So generally when you're in some sort of combat situation and you become disorganized, you hit the unit or the stack with a D2. That will stay in effect until your next organization phase, in which case you can flip every one that is currently D2 to D1. Now the effects of disorganization are the same regardless of 1 or 2. But you have to be in D1 at the end of the turn sequence of play during the reorganization phase so that you can then roll a die and go back to good order. So the 1 and the 2 just controls how long you're in disorganized state. So at the beginning of your turn, you begin the process of recovery. You flip to D1, and that's just an automatic thing, as long as they're not in a zone of influence or zone of control. The next phase is the artillery phase. Artillery is represented as, I think, battalions in the game, and they have, this is the limbered side of the artillery counter, and that's the unlimbered where they can fire. So in your artillery phase, you can either fire your guns, and it acts as a bombardment attack on the enemy, or you can limber them without firing. You can limber, move, and unlimber in the same turn, but you can't fire and move in the same turn. Now the power of artillery is its bombardment. You can inflict disorganization on units at a distance, and even kill them if you get enough hits on them in one attack. So there's a little table on the player aid chart here where you can cross-reference your artillery strength with a few modifiers, roll the die, figure out how many cohesion checks or morale checks that you get to make on your targets. And then the targets roll on a one six-sided die against this small sort of superscript number here. That number next to the strength number is the cohesion number. So when attacked by artillery, you roll your die. If you're, the number or less, you pass. If it's above that number, you fail. Your first failure is disorganized, D2. Second failure would be a retreat, and if you failed a third time, you would be eliminated. So just looking at that artillery table, everywhere you see a 3, that's where you could potentially wipe out a unit in one bombardment attack. So it's hard to do, but it is possible. Now another interesting aspect of this artillery is that both sides may fire in each artillery phase. So if the Confederates have, for some reason, their guns right close to the Federals, it was a Federal turn. Wainwright's battalion could fire on Lane here, and if he were able to disorganize him and make him retreat, he'd be safe. But if not, Lane could then fire on Wainwright and possibly, knock him off the hill there. So each turn you get to bombard your artillery twice. But of course only the phasing player can limber or unlimber. Well, limber his artillery in the artillery phase. Now after artillery is resolved, comes the movement phase. Now this is pretty standard stuff. Units have movement allowances. Terrain has costs. But the number of costs in the terrain are actually fairly small. For instance, this is clear terrain, that's woods. It doesn't cost anything to move through woods. It does cost to move up these, this brown sort of hatching there is a severe slope, so it costs 1 movement point to move up that slope. It costs to move across the blue streams here. The very faded streams, those don't cost. Those are just pretty to look at, but they don't affect play. Now the one thing that sort of balances out the time frame, because it is 1 hour turns, and many of the Brigade games I'm used to play half-hour turns or less. But the movement cost of a road, or the pike here, is 1/4. Now the movement allowance for infantry is 5, so that means we can cross 20 hexes in one turn. So that's a long way. And it plays out correctly as the federal reinforcements arrive way down here. They are able to get to their historic positions at just about these historic times, as you would expect. All units for the phasing player can move during the movement phase, as long as you want them to move and you're cool with moving them. Go right ahead. But what you can't do is enter an enemy zone of control unless you're in command. So if for some reason these regiments were not in command, they could not move adjacent to that rebel regiment there. Now, they could do whatever they wanted with their movement allowance. They could, run in behind him like that. They could run away. Well, the brigade has to stay together. Brigade integrity rules are always in effect. You can't split up your brigade. But if I were to take the 2nd Brigade of the 1st Division here, I could just move him off to the north or anywhere I wanted to put him. And that would be my choice. I mean, if I want to keep guys out of command, take my chances, that's my choice. There's nothing about command that limits movement other than entering zones of control. But after the movement phase, we might assume that someone gets into contact with someone else, and we would have our combat phase. Combat is mandatory for all adjacent units, and maybe more specifically, any defender that is in a zone of control of an attacker, the attacking side, must be attacked. And it doesn't matter how the attacker does that, how they apportion their strength, but they have to attack. So suppose the Federals really want to blow up this hex right there. They might choose to combine these two and attack, but they have to attack that hex. They have to attack that one and that one. So they have to hit all 4 of those defending hexes. So I left out one bit of scale. I figured I'd just do it during the combat overview. But these numbers are strength points. 400 men, 300 men. The stacking limit is 8 strength points, and exactly 8. No overstacking permitted. So that means really, without overlapping the line, you're likely going to get a maximum of 8 strength points attacking any one hex at a time. And of course the defender is going to want to maximize that. And that's really kind of driven by the style of the combat chart. The combat result table is kind of a typical CRT. It is odds based. It is based on a 1d6, so the distribution is fairly small. It has a set of dice roll modifiers for the attacker and the defender. A few for the attacker, many more for the defender. So it's kind of favorable to the defense, which is not unusual. And low odds attacks are pretty severely punished for the attacker. The lower the number, the better for the attacker. The higher the number, the better for the defense. So at 1-to-1 odds, it's kind of hard to get up here. You have to get some modifiers to get yourself into the range that would hurt the attacker, but many more that are going to hurt the defender. That would hurt the defender, and many more that would hurt the attacker. So it's a bloody combat chart. You need to stack the odds in your favor as the attacker, and kind of try to minimize the number of modifiers that are against you as the attacker. Of course, the defender, you want just the opposite. Get low odds and many modifiers. Now, one other feature of these cohesion numbers is here in the combat system. you use the difference between the attacker cohesion number and the defender cohesion number as a modifier. So higher number means you're favored, lower number, you're in worse shape. I think it's kind of a troop quality sort of number, 4 being, I think, the highest. I haven't seen anything higher than that. 1 being the lowest for very poor troops. So if you can get an advantage in your cohesion number, as well as your odds, as well as there's some positional advantages for terrain, you increase your combat, you increase the likelihood of a good combat outcome. There is an aspect of the combat system that I think kind of balances out the time and space scale, if you will. All the while you're in contact, you have to be attacking. You have to resolve a combat. So let's suppose we finish this turn, we get to our combat phase, we attack, and this unit is eliminated, or retreats, whatever. They're no longer in this hex. The Federals could actually occupy with both regiments. That would be 7 strength points. And say for whatever reason, the combat ends in this situation. At this stage, everyone gets to decide whether or not they want to remain in contact, whether or not they want to continue attacking or defending. If they don't want to continue, they can retreat, break contact, and stop the rounds of combat there. If they do want to continue attacking, and they do want to continue defending, you resolve another round of combat. So the net result is that if you're successful, you can keep advancing and capturing territory with multiple rounds of combats and advances in combats. I think that's okay. I mean, it's an hour-long turn. I think that can represent pretty effectively the amount of things happening and the amount of grind and casualties inflicted. When a casualty is inflicted, say if this stack, these 2 regiments attack that one, or, well, let's stack these 2 up. A 3 and a 4, and this cohesion, and these 2 are 4 cohesions. If they have a casualty, a combat result that requires each side to take a loss, you take the first loss from a unit with the same cohesion number that was used to influence the combat, and then you take this similar, so let's say the Confederates launched this defense with the 4 cohesion, and they have to take a loss. They would have to lose that 4 rated regiment, 2 strength points, and now the Federals would have to lose a 4 rated regiment. But they would have that best case to lose 3 strength points. So it is a step loss, but it's also a strength loss. It's not proportional. It's based on the counter mix. So you have to be careful about making your attacks. You want to avoid putting in a gigantic regiment and taking, a huge loss in one combat if possible. But losses aren't permanent, because the next phase after the end of the combat is the reorganization phase. And one part of reorganization is removing those disorganized markers as we looked at before. But also, when brigades take enough losses, losing regiments, they can sort of fall back and regroup and roll dice in order to try to recover their losses. Eliminated regiments are just combat ineffective, and they're eligible to be recovered and brought back to the field. There's a sort of a loose rule. It kind of says if you have a multi-day battle, on the night of the second day, any regiments that still haven't been recovered end up being permanently eliminated. So I think that's a decent way to handle it. Not a lot of fuss, just simple die rolls against their cohesion number to see if you can bring back a regiment that has been lost. So that's gameplay. When you get to the reorganization phase, you flip to the other player. They go through the exact same phases. When that player, the second player, completes, they advance the turn marker and keep going until you have an outcome. So how does it play? This is the position at the end of the first day. Starts at 7 a.m., goes to 8 p.m., and the next turn is night. I've been playing the first day repeatedly, mainly because of the counter count involved. The 800 plus counters it would take to manufacture this entire game was a little daunting. I took it off in chunks. First I played the morning, just a meeting engagement to the north and west of the town. And as I started to get comfortable with that, I manufactured enough counters to then play the afternoon. Almost the full afternoon. The final reinforcements for the Federals I didn't bother to make up because I knew they'd never affect play. So when I look at the position here, this looks pretty historic. I have the Federals along the ridge and the hill occupying the ground that they historically occupied. They've thrown up breastworks around this whole arc. I see the Confederates, of course, ringing that position. These are the casualties at the end of the day. A fair number of steps for the Confederates here, but a massive number of losses for the Federals. The 1st and 11th Corps have been very greatly depleted. Again, as expected. But maybe I made some assumptions about what I would experience that were wrong. I thought it would be more of a literal battle combat game, and it appears to be a little more abstract. These are just my impressions after playing through, I think, 8 times now this morning, or I guess first day kind of scenario. One thing that's absolutely clear is that command is a very, very precious commodity in this game. Which isn't unusual. I mean, that's usually a good thing to do in these games, to try to keep us from doing just whatever we want out of step with history. But, there are a number of ways to achieve that. And the die roll mechanism is, a little unusual. At least it's some different results. For instance, the morning, and really up to about 3 p.m., it is very, very hard to get forces into command. Heath's division that arrives generally is not in command. And Hill, when he arrives, he has no impact on that status. The probabilities remain the same for Heath coming into command. So we end up with a lot of maneuver, searching out flanks just to try to outmaneuver, say, the Federal cavalry and the initial elements of the 1st Corps. But actually no combat phase, because none of the units are in contact. After Pender and then Ewell arrive, your probabilities go up just because you have more forces on the field. So once I got a couple more divisions on the map, I did end up getting one of the formations in command, was able to conduct some combat. But largely it was very quiet until Lee arrived at 3 p.m. And then he has to position himself. At that point, Lee and Longstreet, you can start getting formations into command kind of reliably. The way that works is that you have leaders with command ratings, like Hill here. And he has a 3 for his command rating. And during the command phase, you roll the die, and you have to get 3 or less. If Hill is out of command of his superior, he has to add 1 to that. Now I don't know if it's an exception, but a particular rule is that if a subordinate is stacked with a superior, and that superior rolls in command, the subordinate does not have to. So what you want to do is to stack as many superiors with subordinates as you can to increase your odds of getting a command role. So for instance, Lee is a 6. That means whoever he is stacked with will be in command that turn. So you move Lee to a division that you absolutely want to attack. Kind of similar with Longstreet here. The burden on the attack is on the Confederates, so the Federals largely don't care about command. But Longstreet is a 5, so he has a very high probability, 84% or something. So you're likely to get 2 divisions in command starting at about the 4 p.m. turn. And then you go ahead and you stack Hill with somebody, as well as Ewell with somebody, one of his divisions. That way, if Hill happens to roll in command, you dispense with the second roll for the division, he's automatically in command. And the same for Ewell. And if Hill or Ewell fail their command roll, well, you can just go ahead and roll for the division anyway. It's slightly lower probability because there's a penalty, but at least you get 2 cracks at it. So starting about 4 p.m., 5 p.m., you start getting more forces in command and therefore more combat going on. I said the game might be a little more abstract than I thought. I think that comes about in the combat results. It's a very, very bloody combat table. And since there are long periods where there's no contact, and therefore no actual explicit combat, there are no losses. So actually, by the time I get to my 3 and 4 p.m. turn, the forces tend to be still pretty far north and west of Gettysburg, and very fresh. The Federals have not been pressed at all, and at most they have 3 or 4 steps, depending on the amount of command rolls that might have occurred. But then the combat starts, and we end up losing 12, 14, 16, 20 steps in an hour. Now, steps aren't proportional or equivalent, but if I think of maybe an average number of strength points per step as 4, and we're talking 80 strength points, 8,000 men, combat ineffective in an hour, that seems really high. And if I do that maybe 2 turns in a row, really? 16,000 men? So I think I've sort of rationalized this as all those turns when the forces are just opposite each other but not in contact, not actually in combat in game terms. Well, they're probably, oh boy, I'm stretching here, but they're probably shifting in between these hexes here and actually fighting. Just not a pitched battle. Maybe they're not determined attacks. They're just sniping and shooting. So maybe the combat, the CRT, represents, those sort of spasms of direct, assaults rather than the, rifle fire that's being exchanged in situations like this. Or not. I know I'm probably just reaching here, but just trying to rationalize or understand these effects I'm seeing when I play the game. So maybe the first question is, will I make up the remaining counters to play the second and then third days? I think I'm on the fence about it right now. There's still quite a few counters I'd have to finish. I'm not sure I'm really totally feeling the mechanics of the command system. It's really based completely on random chance. There's little player influence on that random chance. Most leaders are a 3, which means it's a coin flip as to whether or not they're in command. You can't make that any better through any choices you make as a player, except by stacking, the invincible Robert E. Lee with a division leader. There's also this aspect to that where, as a player, you're not responding to the conditions on the field or the moves of your opponent. You're really reacting to the command dice. I mean, if you roll someone in command, you have to attack with them because it is a relatively rare occurrence and you need to take advantage of that. You can't squander that precious resource when it comes your way. So you end up making these, Hood Franklin style attacks because you don't know if you're going to get a chance the next turn. So they're really bloody. You lose lots of men. And then the next turn, heck, you could roll everyone out of command. I mean, this was my 8 p.m. turn, and only one division was in command, and that was Rhodes here, because he was commanded by Lee. Everybody else rolled out of command. That's probably okay, right? It's the end of the day. They wanted to make one last push for the hill. But still, just based on the fact that it's just dice rolls, of 1d6, that's a very low outcome for all those commands I rolled for. And that's what I find to be fairly typical. Attacks are kind of piecemeal. There's little planning or decision-making by the player other than, acknowledging that I happen to roll for somebody and I have to use them while I can. So while there are a lot of aspects to this that appeal to me, and a lot of bits I think do work, I'm not sure I'm having as much fun with it as I expected. So I have another ACW game in the queue I want to look at. I mean, I've spent a couple of weeks on this at this point. So I might make this a secondary investigation before I decide whether or not to continue with the rest of the construction and the full game.